We're hearing from several people today about the bills they're tracking and how they impact wildfire mitigation efforts and forest and watershed health in Colorado. First, we'll be hearing from Daphne Gervais, the Director of Legislative Affairs with the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. After Daphne, we're going to hear from James Lucero, who's the Associate Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs for the Colorado State Forest Service. And then we'll hear from Vaughn Jones, the Wildland Fire Management Section Chief for DFPC. So to start us off, here's Daphne with the Colorado Department of Natural Resources.
Thanks, Sophie, and hi, FACO. Thanks for having me today. As Sophie said, I'm Daphne Gervais. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs with the Department of Natural Resources, actually for only one more week. I am soon heading over to Colorado Parks and Wildlife to start over there in a new role. Focused on implementation of the outdoor strategy. But in my final week, glad to be joining you guys. And I'm really filling in today for Allison Lurch on the DNR policy team, who serves as our Assistant Director of Forest Health and Wildfire Mitigation, and she's out of town today. So I'm glad to have this time with you all today. I wanted to cover at least a few wildfire forest health related bills that the Department of Natural Resources is tracking this legislative session. And then I know my colleagues in our sister agencies at the State Forest Service and DFPC have a few other items to flag for you all. So just diving right into things, the first bill that I wanted to briefly mention is Senate Bill 49. This is a homeowner natural disaster mitigation bill being carried by Senator Snyder and Frizzell, as well as Representative Camacho. This is a bill that DNR is just monitoring, although I know that the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management and DPS is opposing this bill. It really has two key parts. The first is focused on expanding the natural disaster mitigation enterprise. For those of you that are familiar with that, it's a type 2 agency within the Department of Public Safety that was created through legislation in 2021. It helps to fund administration of a grant program, some public education efforts, some technical assistance to local governments as it relates to natural hazard mitigation, and it's funded by fees charged to insurance companies that provide specific types of property or hazard insurance. And so under current law, only local governments, special districts, school districts, or what's considered a government subdivision is eligible to receive assistance through that enterprise. And this bill being considered this year, Senate Bill 49, would expand that to include homeowners associations, so HOAs, as well as individual homeowners. It also adds a new definition of impact resistant roofing material and also property specific mitigation action, and would allow folks that are eligible for support through this enterprise to get grants and assistance related to that kind of thing and those mitigation actions. So that's part one. Part two of this bill is an income tax deduction. So it would create an income tax deduction for anybody that contributes to a catastrophe savings account, specifically for tax years 2027 through 2036. That would be an up to $50,000 per tax year income tax deduction. And really, for people that contribute to that type of savings account, the intent is to have a dedicated funding source to cover insurance deductibles for claims that are coming from hail damage, wildfire damage, or a catastrophic wind event, other sort of uninsured losses related to those events, or any kind of property specific mitigation actions. So I will note that this bill was introduced in January and it has not moved yet through the process, which is pretty atypical and kind of signals that the bill is facing some sort of headwinds. It is expected to decrease state general fund revenue by about 100,000 in fiscal year 26-27, increasing to 200,000 in out years. So it's possible that that general fund impact is part of the headwinds that the bill is facing, along with, I think, some opposition and concerns from the insurance industry. So it's a bit of a TBD on the trajectory of this bill. But again, DNR is just monitoring at this time. And Rob, I'm just seeing your chat there. When I am through with my presentation, I'm happy to link in the chat the bill's webpage where you can find out some more information. So next, wanted to cover Senate Bill 89. This is a bill from Senators Cutter and Baisley and Representative Velasco. It is reestablishing the Wildfire Matters Review Committee, which repealed on September of last year, September 2025. So this bill would reinstate that committee and continue it through 2031. I think most of you are probably familiar with the Wildfire Matters Review Committee, but they're charged with reviewing possible legislation or policy changes related to wildfire mitigation. This bill actually went through its first committee hearing in the Senate Ag and Natural Resources Committee, where they added an amendment to explicitly add wildfire prevention and response to what is within the committee's scope and charge. So that passed on a 5-2 vote in its first committee hearing. There were 2 Republicans on that committee that voted against it, largely due to the budget implications of continuing this committee. Again, really small in the big picture of the budget, but still some kind of general fund impact, which anything with a general fund impact in this budget environment is going to face some sort of resistance. And there is tangentially, there's another bill that's moving through the process that just got introduced from House and Senate leadership that actually suspends interim committees in some form or fashion for this upcoming interim because of budget restraints. And so it is a little bit unclear how this bill will fall into the fold there and if it might have some challenges related to the budget impact. But otherwise, I think everybody understands the value that this committee has brought, and we are interested in continuing to see that work should the bill see that work continue if the bill is successful. Next, I want to cover House Bill 1132. This is a bill on supporting pollinators, specifically on state-owned land. This is a bill from Representative Froelich and Senator Kipp, and it's being spearheaded by PPAN, or the People and Pollinators Action Network, really focused on increasing pollinator habitat on state lands. And there's multiple parts and new responsibilities, goals for state agencies that are outlined throughout this bill. And it specifically applies to the State Forest Service, the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Personnel and Administration, and the Department of Transportation. So it encourages all of those covered agencies to prioritize the use of native plants that support pollinator habitat when we're doing certain renovation, restoration, landscaping, or new construction projects. And really when certain conditions are met, when native plants are available, when it's financially viable, and when using that plant material can be used in a way that furthers plant diversity, increases pollinator habitat, minimizes wildfire hazard mitigation, enhances climate resilience, and protects watershed health. It directs those covered agencies to also balance the use of native plants with other priorities that does include wildfire risk reduction. It establishes several requirements for covered agencies and has some language that says to the extent practicable. So these requirements are fairly flexible, but there's some expectations that our departments will integrate 5 and 10-year goals for the use of native plants in our existing planning processes, coordinate with each other on native seed purchasing, and also coordinate with CBW Seed Warehouse, the State Forest Service, tree nursery, regional nurseries, private nurseries in accomplishing this work. Requirements for establishing a training program for land managers, for integrating mowing and grazing practices based on the 2022 pollinator study. And then there's another section of this bill that is directed to CXU Extension and has them performing a Colorado native plant availability study. And again, with all of the necessary caveats on available funding. So we are in a support position on this bill. We worked closely with advocates to make sure that we've got built-in flexibility to meet these requirements, but also move the needle for pollinator habitat conservation. So ultimately, we feel good about where the bill is currently. It did pass out of the House Ag, Water, and Natural Resources Committee, and it is set to go to the House Finance Committee, I believe, next week. And then next I wanted to cover House Bill 1184. This is titled The Sunset Process for the Forest Health Council. This bill implements recommendations from the DORA Sunset Report, the Department of Regulatory Agency's Sunset Review of the Forest Health Council. And it does so by continuing the council, which was set to repeal in September of this year. The report initially recommended indefinite continuation. Ultimately, they did add an amendment to do another sunset review of the council in 2033, just generally in the spirit of government transparency. But for anybody that's unfamiliar with the Forest Health Council, it was created through legislation in 2021, has 26 volunteer members from all sorts of different stakeholder groups and perspectives. And really their mission is to improve forest health through integrated science-based approaches with a focus on cross-jurisdictional collaboration to reduce wildfire risk, restore ecological resilience, safeguard communities and water supplies, mitigate and adapt to climate change, support local economies, and protect recreation areas. So that is a fairly broad mission. Over the last few years, they've done some really tremendous work, including through the development of a forest resilience guide, the development of legislative recommendations that did ultimately translate to successful legislation, including on forestry-related workforce development. So we have seen a lot of value in this council and fully support it continuing through this bill. So this has passed out of the House Ag, Water, and Natural Resources Committee and it is set to go to House Appropriations next. And then just a couple more for you all before I turn it over to my colleagues. House Bill 1310 is probably one that many of you have heard of recently. This is titled Wildfire Resilience Grant Money. Essentially what this bill does is it transfers an increasing proportion of funding from the Wildfire Mitigation Capacity Development Fund and moves that over to the Wildfire Resilience Homes Grant Program in the Division of Fire Prevention and Control. It sets certain criteria for DFPC to use when issuing those wildfire resilient homes grants. And essentially, as I said, it would be an increasing proportion of that funding from the Wildfire Mitigation Capacity Development Fund, starting at 10%, growing to 30%, and ultimately in fiscal year 29, 30 and beyond, 50% of that funding getting redirected. Probably unsurprisingly to many of you, we are in an opposed position on this bill. The Wildfire Mitigation Capacity Development Fund is the source of funding for the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, or COSWAP. That is a program in DNR that supports strategically placed wildfire risk reduction and watershed protection projects, as well as workforce development projects. COSWAP was developed after the really devastating 2020 wildfire year and has shown really tremendous value with landscape scale mitigation, training of Department of Corrections SWIFT crews, and really investing these dollars in strategic focus areas where we can stretch our dollars the furthest. So I am happy to provide more information on what COSWAP does and its focus, its success over the last few years. Ultimately, I think we all very much appreciate that home hardening is an important part of the mix when it comes to our wildfire mitigation strategies, but we don't support the funding source proposed in this bill and essentially a model that is robbing Peter to pay Paul. So that is set to go to House Agriculture, Water, and Natural Resources Committee. It was originally set for a hearing this afternoon. That did get delayed. So that signals that there may be changes that the sponsor is working on, but we don't know yet what those will be. So don't know for sure yet when the next committee hearing date will be set. And then I think finally on my list, wanted to briefly touch on House Bill 1289, modification of certain tax expenditures. On its face, this doesn't seem like a bill that would be of interest to a group like FACO, but this actually does have two sections that relate to forestry. So first off, it changes the wildfire mitigation tax credit so that it also covers the cost of thinning trees that are at risk of mountain pine beetle or spruce beetle infestation. or trees that have already been killed by those beetles. It also changes the amount of the credit that people can receive and allows any unused portion of the credit to be carried forward and used for up to 5 years. And then the second section we care about brings back a sales and use tax exemption for wood products made from trees in Colorado that were killed or infested by mountain pine beetle or spruce beetle. The current tax break is scheduled to expire on June 30th of this year, and this bill would restart it on July 1st of 2027 and through 2032. So that is a bill that we support, really focus on those two sections, and that bill is set to go to House Finance. Also was supposed to be this afternoon, did ultimately get rescheduled, so we're waiting for a new date on that as well. I think that I took up plenty of time, but I think that covers all of the bills that we are actively engaged on. So I'm happy to take any questions or otherwise turn it over to my colleagues.
Okay, well, if no one has any questions, we can also save the questions for after the three of you present, and we can move on to hearing from James Lucero. Like I said, he's the Associate Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs for the Colorado State Forest Service. James?
Sophie, and thanks, Daphne, for carrying a lot of that bulk there. Just for a quick reference, Daphne and I work really well together. Being that we are the State Forest Service, we are housed within Colorado State University. However, we do function as the Division of Forestry within the Department of Natural Resources, so there's a lot of close work there. So just wanted to say thanks to Daphne for her work in covering those other bills. I'm going to talk about two specific bills for the State Forest Service that might be of interest to this group. The first one is going to be House Bill 261213. Much like the other sunset bills that she's kind of talked about, this one was a sunset for one of our grant programs, the Biomass Utilization Grant Program. Ultimately, after DORA completed their sunset review, unlike the Forest Health Council, this recommendation was to sunset the grant program. Initially, we got a small grant of about $500,000 in order to implement this. It went to about 12 different projects. The grant program itself was pretty successful in carrying out the legislative intent of that bill. However, being in the budget the budget year that we're in and in the foreseeable future, we do have the ability to take out loans. And so ultimately, DORA said that there was no need to continue this grant program because really we can just continue doing the biomass authorities that are granted to us in statute. So that bill is actually going to sunset this grant program. It has already passed the House. It passed the House unanimously, and it has been introduced in the Senate, and it is just waiting for that meeting to be scheduled. The other bill that is going to be specific to the State Forest Service is going to be House Bill 1205. This is concerning Good Neighbor Authority. So back in January 2025, the federal government actually passed the excuse me, the Explore Act, and that is the Expanding Public Lands Outdoor Recreation Experiences Act. Basically, this group should be familiar with Good Neighbor Authority. It's an agreement that the federal government can work with state agencies, much like the State Forest Service or other entities, to do work on federal lands. The U.S. Forest Service will direct that work, but then they'll contract basically out to the state agencies to do that work. So what 1205 is doing is in January 2025, under the Explore Act, there was more authority granted to what GNA could do. Before Explore passed, it was really just dedicated to the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and it was just on Forest Service lands. With Explore, it actually expands that to work with state agencies, and it expands the federal government entities allowed to work with us. So it's no longer just the U.S. Forest Service. It extends to the National Park Service. It extends to the Fish and Wildlife Service and a bunch of other agencies. And it changes where we can actually do that work too. So it's not specific to state forest lands. It can be in national parks. It can be in fish and wildlife land. And so basically what this is doing is it's trying to conform our state code, our current state code, to match existing federal code. And so This is a plug for the Forest Health Council. This is that bill that Daphne was talking about for the sunset, where it was continued to recommend first indefinitely, and then I think it changed it to every 7 years. This was actually a recommendation put forward by the Forest Health Council that ultimately the Wildfire Matters Review Committee did accept, and so this is a Wildfire Matters Review Committee bill. It did pass. It did pass the House already. There was one lone no vote in the House, and it is scheduled up in the Senate Agricultural and Natural Resources Committee this Thursday at 1:30. Those are the only two bills that are specific to the State Forest Service, but like Daphne, I'll hold here and see if there's questions.
Great, thanks, James. Give people a second if anyone has any questions. And we can always take them after we hear from Vaughn. And so Vaughn Jones is the Wildland Fire Management Section Chief for DFPC. Vaughn?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for having me. I will say some of the remaining bills are not necessarily in my program area of expertise, but we wanted to make sure we were on here to talk about it with you all, and maybe the benefit of going last after Daphne and James is they pretty much covered a lot of this, so I shouldn't have to talk too awful long. A big one for us is House Bill 26-1166, which is a Department of Public Safety supplemental, but this is related to the Wildfire Resiliency Code Board. And again, I think a lot of you are aware of that. That's still working through the process. But any jurisdiction that has it, within the defined wildland and urban interface as defined by the code board is required to adopt and implement building codes that meet or exceed those standards adopted by the board. And they are so those jurisdictions are supposed to implement the new code within 9 months of the board adopting the code, which was last July. So obviously we're getting to crunch time here where that needs to be adopted. And then in part of that process and with statute, it is there's kind of an assumption, which may or may not be accurate, that most governing bodies have the capability to enforce codes through their internal rules or agreements. But it also further allows those entities that don't have the mechanisms to enforce the code to request support from DFPC. And so what this supplemental did really in our mind is it basically began the process of building out a Colorado Wildfire Resiliency Code unit within DFPC, within our fire prevention branch. And it is, again, just it gets a start on us to provide us with some resources to help those local jurisdictions that don't have the expertise. So what it did is it gives us 3 positions prorated for the current fiscal year. And then in the next fiscal year, beginning July 1st, it'll expand to 5. And really that group initially will be focused on the enforcement and desk review of plans and a little bit helping on-site review to those local jurisdictions. So that's obviously kind of a big one for us. And then a few others that I thought I would mention just really quickly. And I think it was discussed earlier, but Senate Bill 89, recreating the Wildfire Matters Review Committee. We at DFPC have support for that. I think as Daphne explained, we'll see whether anything with a fiscal note is able to make it through process or not. But obviously, collectively, I think the agencies represented here and a lot of you on the call support that. And to me, the value is having that legislative body that is focused on bringing related issues to that group, and those legislators have some knowledge in that area is pretty important. The next one we were going to mention just really quickly is House Bill 1187, which is sunset fire suppression programs. And again, that's in our fire life safety section. And when we talk about fire suppression, this is more, sprinklers, interior things with schools, healthcare facilities, those kind of things. So basically, we're supporting that would, extend that program and the rules for another 11 years. And then also, as discussed, the last one that I have is House Bill 1310, the Wildfire Resiliency Grant money. We are officially neutral on that one. We fully recognize and support and respect where State Forest Service and DNR on that. And really, it gets down to that whole issue of this is obviously a big complex program. We have to figure out where we utilize our existing funding. And for us, again, we think there's some value. Obviously, we do in this program. A couple years ago, that program was started, and at least it created the funds, and there's a very small amount of money in there. We think, the resiliency is important as a piece of the puzzle, getting to things eventually like insurance availability and affordability. We also realize there's competing interests and not a lot of money to go around, but for us right now, we're neutral on that. So I think with that, Sophie, that is all I have for right now.
Sweet. Thanks, Vaughn. Does anyone have any questions they want to share in the chat? Lisa?
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry, it just spurred when you were talking, Vaughn. I'm trying to put my video on. Sorry. Hi. I have a question. Well, I have two questions, but the first one is about 1310, which I know a couple other people mentioned. So, is that the program that was started? I think you just said this, but I want to make sure I heard it correctly. A few years ago, and it was like a pilot thing, and some people applied, and then it ran out of money, basically. It was through DFPC for mitigation and stuff. Is that the
Yep.
same thing?
I'm
Okay,
pretty sure, yep, it is, Lisa. And like I said, there was a little bit of money. It created the fund, which was a
right,
good starting point. And then the idea was if and when there was more money available down the road, it would add to that program. But
right.
you
I think I went to
right.
a workshop on that at the last FACO conference. But anyway, okay. That makes sense. And then I was going to ask something else about that one, and I just forgot. Oh well, okay. And then my other question, if I think of that one, I'll come back, is I mean, generally speaking, um, oh, I remembered it. Sorry. Okay. So how, I mean, if that bill in theory passes, I'm not saying I'm supporting it or not, but because it's going to divert money from something else. How does that program with I know you're giving grants for mitigation and stuff like that. How is that going to interact with the potential bill that's coming up about fortified roofs, as well as 1182 that's going in from last year that's going into effect in July, with about the like getting your risk, your wildfire insurance risk score, and because you mentioned something about insurance in the future and about it's supposed to give discounts for doing mitigation, but I mean, the only discount is your premium. So is it supposed to work together with that to like incentivize people to actually do it so then they can get the discount? I guess my question is, how are all these bills going to interact with each other? Which maybe you can't answer, but
Yeah, it's a great question. And I may honestly, Lisa, probably I'm not unfortunately the right person for all of that. But I think, and when I talked about insurance availability and affordability, to me, I don't know if this bill specifically gets to that, but to me, it's one of the big picture things where all of these programs we're
right.
talking about have to target that. And then I think for that grant program in particular, then what we would look at, if and when there's a need, we would look at the rulemaking process and the grant criteria and try to connect those to other things where there's a logical, some similarities there. And that's unfortunately
Right.
about all I know on that piece, but I could track down more if needed.
No, that's fine. I was just curious because like in 1182 from last year it talks about, how it has to be a scientific wildfire, certification program or IBHS, which is very expensive and difficult, so I guess I'm just trying to figure out how all this is all going to go together, but it's all good anyway. And then my general question for everybody or all the people presenting, and I don't know, Aaron, if you're talking about the sports bill too, the sporting goods thing, but is are are you guys looking for, I mean, we as like citizens to weigh in on these if we have an opinion? I guess that's my last question. Thank you.
I think I would quickly chime in, and you probably heard that some of these bills are moving through the process without much resistance.
Right.
Given where we are on 1310, the bill that's diverting funding away from co-swap, I think that the more folks that are willing to come out and speak in opposition to that bill, the better. And Mostly like we're trying to target any individuals or organizations or entities that have seen direct benefits from the co-swap program, whether that's through being a recipient of one of those grants directly or seeing the impacts of one of those projects. I think we would welcome support in opposing that bill for anybody that shares our concerns.
Great. Thanks, Daphne, and thanks, Lisa, for the questions. I think I'll let Meg ask a question if you've got one.
Yeah, I do. Hey, good to see you, Vaughn. Long time no see. And I'm not sure you could answer this or this is for Daphne on 1310. Just curious because it's kind of vague of what the scope of work is for DFPC for those funds. Obviously, as Daphne said, we're all support home hardening. I'm on a wildfire partners team that is very heavy into home hardening and defensible space. But also have benefited quite well from the co-swap program. So if there's any like scope of work that is out there from DFPC supporting their charge for that money, be curious to hear that.
Okay, thanks, Meg. Yeah, and what I will do is I'll commit to track or fight either tracking it down or finding someone who actually knows instead of me, and then I can pass that on with whoever from the group so they can share with everybody else. But that's the best I could do this afternoon.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions before we move to our next speaker?
I think Rob, Sophie. Go ahead, Rob.
Oh,
Yeah, just super quick note from the field. The fortified roofing program is my experience is that we're having a couple challenges, mainly in the way that the eave metal ties into the underlayment. The fortified program wants it exactly opposite of what the International Residential Building Codes and manufacturer specs call for. So what that means in layman terms is if we were to build the fortified way, we would fail roof inspection at this point. I think that's probably going to change as all of this moves forward. Building inspectors are going to kind of get hip to it, but as of right now, it is a consideration. We can't build it that way and still pass. So just like I said, a little note from the field.
sweet. Thanks, Rob. Anyone else have any questions before we move on? Okay. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to update us on these current legislations. And like I said in the chat, we will have some cleaned up notes on the different bills that were mentioned today and share that with you guys afterwards. And since there's no more questions, we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Aaron. Aaron is the Colorado Policy Director at the Nature Conservancy, and he's going to speak to us today about a proposed ballot measure for this fall: protect Colorado's land and water, prevent wildfires. Aaron?
Thanks. And let me see if I can share the slides.
Awesome.
I'm sure it'll show in the wrong view. Does that look correct, or are you seeing the wrong one? Are you seeing my next slide?
We can see your slides on the side too.
How about that?
That's perfect.
Perfect. Well, thank you, and thanks everybody for letting me join you. So, here I'm Aaron Citron, Policy Director with the Nature Conservancy for Colorado. We're partnering with a few other initially conservation groups, Western Resource Advocates, the Trust for Public Land, and Conservation Colorado, to explore a conservation funding ballot initiative for the November 2026 election. I see people are making comments in the chat. I can't see the chat, so I will look at that in a little bit. And we're coming to this basically from two angles. One is that we've all been really engaged in development of Colorado's new outdoors strategy, which I'm happy to link in the chat after the presentation, which is an attempt to bring together conservation, restoration, outdoor recreation, and climate resiliency planning under a single coordinated umbrella. And that, as you can imagine, will require some funding to implement. The program has been run with funding out of Great Outdoors Colorado by Colorado Parks and Wildlife with a lot of different partners over the last couple of years. In addition, we've been participating in the watershed, I always forget which W is first, Watershed and Wildfire Initiative for Resilient Colorado. Maybe it's the other order, the work process. Rob Addington, my colleague, has been sitting there. And that effort as well has been identifying funding needs for primarily wildfire risk mitigation efforts at the state, federal, local level, and also looking at opportunities for things like wood products utilization and private markets to come to play. So with those two as our baseline, we're exploring ways to generate between $100 and $200 million annually to implement those two strategies. I don't need to tell any of you this, but this is why we're doing it. Wildfire risk is really severe. We've seen over 1.5 million acres of land burned in the recent years. 80% of our land is at risk of some form of development, really is not permanently conserved. And that leads us to $100 to $200 million of an estimated funding shortfall, depending upon how you calculate the need and depending upon how much of the local, the existing resources remain available from different sources. Again, the kind of significant buckets of funding would be things like conservation. That could be private land conservation. It could be restoration of lands, recreation. Some of that is outdoor access. We're not talking about mandating access, but helping get people out into the landscape through infrastructure, trails, state parks, fishing access, like in that lovely picture, things like that. And then wildfire risk reduction, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. So we are proposing to generate around $175 million annually without raising taxes. And we're going to do that by directing the state to retain and spend the amount of money generated annually from existing sales tax on sporting goods and equipment. That equals $175 million above the cap that's mandated under the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, or TABOR. So this is frequently referred to as a de-Brucing measure, taking it out from under Douglas Bruce's Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. So essentially, it's existing money that the state can't currently spend, and it would be distributed in this way: 47.5%, or about $83 million a year, would be distributed through 4 existing state grant programs: the Forest Restoration and Wildfire Risk Mitigation Grant Program and the Healthy Forests and Vibrant Communities Fund, both at the State Forest Service, the COSWAP program, and the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program, one at DNR, one at CWCB. Another $47.5 million to Great Outdoors Colorado to implement the outdoor strategy. Really, that would be distributed through their 4 existing constitutional buckets. And then the remaining 5% will be split in half, with 2.5% or $4.3 million a year, going to outdoor recreation workforce development to create more jobs in that space, and 2.5% or $4.3 million a year to the Outdoor Equity Grant Program. We don't represent it here because it's not something that a lot of people will understand when we make this presentation, but we're proposing that an initial $10 million come out in year 1 to seed the relatively new the insurance program that we created last year, and I can't think of the word, I apologize. Program we helped create last year to provide a little more protection for folks trying to do prescribed burns by certified burners. So as was mentioned, this is the number that the initiative currently has. In Colorado, and I'll stop my rambling, with the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, we're required to put quite a bit of text on the ballot. This is actually, I need to update this. We've gone back to the title board that actually sets the title. This is not the actual language that folks would see. And we likely are going to be refiling through our state process that I'm happy to explain that will get us again another title to make sure that our funds will continue to be available with the expectation of other fiscal measures being on the 2026 ballot. So our hope is that we'll be out collecting signatures by, let's say, middle of April. And we'll then be kind of going out with a little more of a request for people to sign on, ideally in support, to help us get across the finish line and trying to get this more into the public consciousness. So I need to update the slide. That's not the real language, but essentially, like I said, the idea is we would be debrucing $175 million and distributing it as I mentioned before. So I'm happy to answer questions. I will take down the slides because I see people are maybe asking things in the chat. This money would not come from the lottery. So I know there's a lot of conversation right now about proposed changes to the lottery that could reduce future revenue from that. So GOCO is capped. That money does come from the lottery, but unless Daphne or somebody corrects me, they're not going to get any more from the lottery. The Outdoor Equity Grant Program is part of that lottery waterfall. So they are hoping to get money out of the lottery. The claims fund. Thank you. The Prescribed Fire Claims Fund is what I was going for. I don't know why I could not get that word. So we're trying to get more annual money into the Outdoor Equity Grant Program. So that's one where there's some potential overlap. There's also some specific programs at CPW that would get money if there's excess from the lottery as it grows for outdoor recreation, that there could be some overlap. Right now, the outdoor rec money would be passed through from the additional funds at GOCO. So it is not money from the lottery. There are a couple programs that could be funded by both lottery spillover or our measure if we're successful, but mostly this is separate, recognizing that GOCO, of course, gets money from the lottery, and we're trying to essentially double the amount of money that GOCO gets annually so they can expand the work they're doing for large landscape conservation, outdoor recreation, local parks, all the various things that I think a lot of people are really excited about. That's less relevant maybe to this group, except just general support for the outdoors.
Thanks.
So yeah, happy to.
I
Yeah.
had a question just about if there are FACO participants here who want to continue to learn more about the ballot or track its progress or engage in the measure, how would they go about doing that?
Good question. Thank you. So I put my email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. There will be updates. You can check the website. I can put the current link, but like I said, we'll refile and it will no longer be number 228. We'll get a higher number when we refile later this week. I'm happy to send you, Sophie, or somebody else an update once that happens, and you can check on the website what the progress is. But if you have specific questions, I would say reach out to me. We don't have a website yet. I don't know if I've sent you yet. I can send you the fact sheet. I think you might have received it when I made a similar presentation last week, but we have a fact sheet that I'm happy to send around to people. Maybe I can drop it in the chat. I'll see if that'll work. Otherwise, my hope is that we'll have our final title that will go out for petition gathering in the next, I'd have to look at the specific date, but by I think the first week of April, we should have that. And at that point, we'll create some sort of a public presence, a website, et cetera, if we decide to pursue it.
Awesome. Thanks. Does anyone else have any questions for Aaron? Sweet. Well, thanks, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you.
Everyone's got your email in the chat if they need to reach out to you afterwards.